Okay, our second session is about Bulgaria. In the same period as we spoke about in the last lecture in the 1980s, so in the period of late socialism. I'm going to try to be a little bit quicker, or at least make this a little bit shorter than the last lecture, which was a little bit longer than I had anticipated. But I should warn you that that can be problematic because the topic is one that I'm particularly fond of, and Bulgaria and Bulgarian things are things that are of great interest to me. The language and the history and the culture. So there are considerable risks of getting caught up in one of these many topics, which to me are quite fascinating, and I hope will be at least a little bit interesting to you too. But I'll try to sort of keep my blinkers on and try to keep moving forward so we don't take too long. In slide one, this is the remarkable monument house of the Bulgarian Communist Party. It's in Buzluja, which is in the Balkan mountain range in the middle of Bulgaria. It's the place where the Social Democratic Party, so the Communist Party, what would become the Communist Party, was founded by a man called Dimitar Blagoev. I'll have to write that down for anyone who's interested. And so in the 1980s, this incredible, colloquially known as the UFO building, was constructed as a meeting house and as a sort of meeting point. It commands these incredible views. I visited for the first time last summer. In the summer or the autumn of 2019, my friend and I got a car and went out there. And went to look at this thing, and it's derelict now. It is one of the shames is that you can't go inside. It's broken glass and debris, and there's all kind of health and safety risks. I was willing to take them actually, but we simply were not able to get it. It's been boarded up. But there are incredible murals on the inside of this building, and there's a big discussion about what to do with this monument house, because many people consider this to be, and I must admit that I would be one of those people, consider it to be a very important example of socialist modernist architecture, but at the same time, a lot of people also, I suppose, quite rightly see this as a souvenir of a communist period, which many people would have very negative connotations, very negative feelings towards. So there's a discussion about what's going to happen to this, but I think the last thing I heard is that they are going to try to restore this and turn it into I don't know what, like a restaurant or a hotel or I don't know, something like this. It's part of a larger discussion about what to do with the heritage of the socialist period. And in the 90s and in the early aughts, it was very often the case that these buildings would simply be knocked down because the anti-communist sentiment and the ill feeling towards that period was so strong that people just didn't want to, they don't want these buildings to be around anymore. A new generation is kind of emerging, which is much more protective of those. So, for example, in Prague, some of my friends are involved in a movement which is called in English No Demolitions. And it's a kind of a grassroots movement which is intent on preserving some of these buildings, and that there was a kind of what I thought was an unfortunate example of a building from the 70s which was knocked down to make way for a shopping mall. So there was there was a push against that. I mean, the problem is that very often these communist buildings are on prime real estate. They're in the middle of town, and if you build a block of apartments or a hotel or a shopping mall, you can make a massive profit on that. And so developers are desperate to get hold of these things, and of course they don't want. But look, you could say the same about any historical building. You could say the same about the Abbey Theatre, for God's sakes, or the GPO. Heaven forbid that anyone ever tries to harm those buildings. Okay, so we're talking about Bulgaria today. let's do a very quick recap of the story of Bulgaria. It's a Balkan country, and as we can see in slide number 2, once upon a time it had been part of the Ottoman Empire. So like Albania, like Serbia, like Greece, although of course we're not really speaking about Greece in this module, like Romania, parts of Romania. The country had once upon a time been part of the Ottoman system. And the Ottoman legacy is still one which is present in various forms within throughout the Balkans, but also within Bulgaria. So there are mosques, there are medreses, not as many as there used to be, because many of those have been destroyed. If you want to talk about the destruction of cultural heritage, when the country was liberated from the Ottoman Empire, there was a backlash, of course, against all things Muslim. They were considered to be remnants of the old empire, and so many mosques were destroyed, many medreses, Islamic religious schools were destroyed. But there are still some very nice examples in the town Plovdiv, the city Plovdiv, or the capital Sofia. There's a beautiful mosque and baths and bathing. Once upon a time, Ottoman baths are there as well. Now the other legacy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on in the lecture, is the legacy of the Muslim presence itself, the presence in the population. There wasn't widespread conversion in Bulgaria as there had been, for example, in Albania and in Bosnia and in parts of Greece. But nevertheless, there was a sizable conversion. And when Bulgaria was liberated, it was essentially a Christian national state, but there was still a significant portion of the population that were Muslim. And this remains true throughout the 20th century. And we'll talk a little bit about that part of the population momentarily. Now, the other thing is that the revolution, the national revolution, the national liberation against the Ottoman Empire was spearheaded by guerrilla groups, by paramilitaries. To a certain extent, it's not different in places like Ireland or in places like Algeria or in somewhere else. Decolonization is very often the preserve of irregular paramilitary forces, because there's no national army, so there's no other way to do it than to sort of do it through these irregular movements. And the most notorious movement for national liberation is the one that I've depicted in slide number 3, the Internal Macedonian Revolutionary Organization, or IMRO for short, VIMRO in the Bulgarian. And this was a movement which operated in the Macedonian territories of the Ottoman Empire, fought against the Ottoman Empire, but very often fought against rival Christian bands from Greece and from Serbia. In fact, more often than not, it fought against those bands than it did against the Ottoman Empire. Now, the legacy of this movement remains a very controversial topic, particularly the identity of some of its commanders. The Macedonians will claim that they're Macedonian. The Bulgarians will claim that they're Bulgarian. When you actually open up the memoirs, when you open up the primary sources of the time, it's unclear what many of these people think they are and how they would articulate their identity. But it's also clear that what they understand to be national identity is very different from what we would understand it to be in the 21st century. So it's a very important memory struggle, and it is one that is extremely fiercely contested to this day. And last year I had a fellowship in Sofia, in the Bulgarian capital, and I went to see some people to meet them in the Macedonian Historical Institute, which was formed originally in the 1920s by some of these hard cases that you can see in the picture. And they remain quite passionate people, I must say. We had some raised voices as we tried to argue the intricacies of, or I tried to argue the intricacies of Macedonian identity, and they tried to argue against me. We argued about these things. Okay, now Bulgaria in the Second World War was allied with the Axis powers, and the most interesting thing I think about this, it was allied essentially because it hoped that it could regain territories that it had lost because it had been on the losing side at the end of the Second World War. Ultimately, of course, it was on the losing side also of the First World War. Ultimately, it was also on the losing side in the Second World War. The most interesting thing about Bulgaria in the Second World War is that there was no Holocaust in the country. The Bulgarian Jewish population within Bulgaria itself were largely spared the attempted annihilation that had happened in other parts of Central and Eastern Europe, so in Romania, in Czechoslovakia. The country was not occupied. It had its own government. It had its own parliament, which operated during the Second World War. It had its own political autonomy, but it was part of the Nazi bloc. It was part of the Axis, and in that sense, it was compelled to a certain extent to carry out the Holocaust, but it didn't. And so this is a point of pride for many people in Bulgaria, I think quite rightly. And it is also one of the big research questions as to why this didn't take place. Why the Jewish population were preserved when elsewhere they had been annihilated. Okay, the communists came to power at the end of the Second World War. That's in slide number 5. The notable thing about the seizure of power in Bulgaria is that it was accomplished with a huge amount of bloodshed. When the communists came to power, they were acutely aware that the previous traditions of the interwar period and the Second World War, the previous political figures, the previous national figures were potentially a very serious rival, a very serious opponent for them, and needed essentially to be liquidated in no uncertain terms. So the seizure of power we've seen everywhere, haven't we? When we talked about the Stalinization of the Eastern Bloc, of Central and Eastern Europe, that it involved very often violence, oppression, persecution, kangaroo courts, and these sorts of things. It was particularly savage in Bulgaria. There were so-called people's courts of various size. I've got a picture here in slide number 5. Of the National Court in Sofia, in the Bulgarian capital. But there were courts of various size throughout the country, and their job was essentially to sort of eliminate political rivals, and they did that. And in fact, this is an image of the pre-war government, so the government that had been allied with the Axis powers during the Second World War, being sentenced to death. In fact, the entire cabinet was found guilty of treason. And was sentenced to death. The first leader was our friend Georgy Dimitrov. He, of course, had been close to Stalin during the Second World War. He was the hero of the Reichstag fire trial in 1934. And he became naturally the general secretary of the Communist Party briefly from 1946 until his death. In 1949, whereafter he was a mausoleum was put up very much in the style of at the time Lenin and also Stalin. The mausoleum was destroyed in the 90s. I can't remember exactly when, but it was dynamited actually, and then now there's just a sort of it's in the center of Sofia, and there's now just a sort of a blank space. Okay. Eventually, he was succeeded by there was a guy after him called Chernenko for a brief period, and then the big figure at the time was a man called Todor Zhivkov. He became the general secretary of the Bulgarian Communist Party in 1954, and he would remain in that position until 1989. So for a very long time indeed, Todor Zhivkov was essentially the dictator of Bulgaria. What was he like? To all extents and purposes, he was a very boring guy. He was not a remarkably charismatic figure. He was a very bureaucratic figure. The Bulgarian Communist Party did what they do. They attempted to create a personality cult out of him, but the material was not particularly promising. And Zhivkov was a very underwhelming figure, not one who would inspire a huge amount of, would inspire particularly an impressive figure. So he was a guy who just sort of was considered to be a loyal worker, hard worker, someone who grafted for the communist, the realization of communism, and then the respect was sort of paid to him for this. Now, Bulgaria was a very loyal state under Zhivkov, loyal, that is, to the Soviet Union. Bulgarian attitudes towards Russia are relatively complicated. There are complications. Historically, there have been complications in Bulgarian-Russian relations, but nevertheless, there are many instances of cooperation, of friendly relations, and there's a relatively positive, to this day, in fact, there's a relatively positive memory of Russia, an idea towards Russia, and so this goes right back to the 19th century. So again, an example. When I lived in Sofia, I lived next to the Russian Cultural Center, and I mean, every night they were doing something for the Russian culture. There were book readings, there were chess tournaments, there were ballet recitals. The bookshop had excellent Russian literature and Russian books. So relations between these two countries were very cordial and very close, and they were under Zhivkov as well. Throughout, there's no memory of, for example, like in Poland, there's no memory of empire. There's no invasion like there was in Hungary or in Czechoslovakia. So generally speaking, the relations were very good. Now, several times during the Cold War, Zhivkov reached out to the USSR and offered to transform Bulgaria into the 16th Republic of the USSR. So it would become not an independent state, but a socialist republic on the same par as Ukraine at that time, or Kazakhstan, or the Baltic states, or Belarus, or Moldova, or Armenia, or Georgia, or take your pick, one of the 15. It was essentially a piece of diplomatic nothing. Think about the map. It's not possible. There's no border. I suppose there's the Black Sea, which is a kind of blue water border. But it would be impossible, and Romania is in the way. And I don't believe. I didn't look at the sources. I didn't study this. I didn't go to the archive and try and figure out what Zhivkov meant by this, but I don't think that he was being particularly serious. A couple of other interesting points. Bulgaria has touristic treasures. The Black Sea coast in the east of the country, and also the mountain ranges, which are great for hiking. I did a lot of hiking when I was there. And so the Black Sea coast became a tourist destination first and foremost for other people from the Eastern Bloc. It was developed from the 1950s onwards. The very first tourists who started to come to the Black Sea and stay in the hotels and stay on the beach were the Czechoslovaks, from the 1950s onwards. And this was a means of Zhivkov and of the Bulgarians of kind of, creating revenue, creating hard currency profits, and the Communist Party under Zhivkov exploited the natural resources and the natural wealth that they had on the Black Sea and that they had in the mountains. There's also pretty good skiing. I don't ski, but there's actually pretty good skiing in Bulgaria as well, about an hour south of Sofia, or even on the Sofia Mountains, Vitosha. So you can do a lot of things in Bulgaria. I should work for the tourist board because I'm simply singing the praises. They marketed this in the terms that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, in the terms of tourism and consumption. Bulgarian tourism was marketed. There were in-tourist hotels. There was infrastructure. They even invented their own salad, which I put up in a picture here. It's called the Shopska salad. It's quite tasty. I quite like it. It's usually, there shouldn't be an olive on the top, but it's this kind of white cheese, soft cheese, cucumbers, and tomatoes or peppers at the bottom. Also some onions. If it's dressed properly, it's actually quite a tasty lunch. The colors that were chosen, and I'm not kidding about this. Very often people don't believe me, but this is absolutely true. The various colors coordinate to the Bulgarian flag. So this salad is designed to look like the Bulgarian flag, and they promoted it. My friend has written some very nice articles about this, and they promoted it as the Bulgarian national salad. Now, so some of you may have noticed that I spent too much time with social media and on Twitter. And a few months ago, I posted this story about Shopska salad, which I promise you is absolutely true. It was created as a touristic marketing device. And I posted this and I said, here's the Shopska salad. It is a Bulgarian national salad, and the colors, it's made to look like the Bulgarian national flag. No one believed me, and there was a huge amount of backlash against me, particularly from people from Macedonia, who complained that I was a sort of Westerner who was saying, "Oh, you think that we're just primitive and we can't make our own salads," and so there's a lot of anger. I mean, but the Balkan parts of Twitter very often are quite angry places, and this was one example of people getting very upset about a salad. So that just goes to tell you. Okay, now, but a bit more seriously, a couple of other things that happened. It's sort of, there's a very famous, this is on slide number 9, there's a very famous Bulgarian dissident, a man called Georgi Markov. He was a writer who had been part of the Bulgarian official communist setup in the sort of the 50s and the 60s. He had been one of the writers who was particularly well liked by the communist regime, and he wrote a lot of sort of socialist realist pieces for them, and he was very sort of he was very highly regarded. He eventually became disillusioned by Zhivkov, with whom he was a personal friend, and or at least personally known to him, and defected and left the country and moved to London. And in London, he would broadcast articles for articles and speeches for Radio Free Europe, which is the anti-communist broadcaster based in Munich at the time, that tried to sort of send signals back into the communist bloc to try to undermine the regime. So it's basically CIA propaganda. And Markov wrote pieces and performed pieces for them. And it's not exactly clear what happened. He was sort of warned not to do this obliquely it seems that he was warned by the communist regime in Bulgaria that he should stop doing this. But he carried on doing it. And eventually one morning, as he was walking to work in 1978, he was crossing the London Bridge, and he just sort of bumped into someone. Someone bumped into him very innocuously and sort of prodded him with an umbrella, apologized, and then walked off, and Markov walked off as well. The umbrella had a poison tip. It was poisoned with racine, which is extremely deadly. agent, and later that day Markov took ill, and a few days later, in terrible agony, Markov died. It was clearly an operation, although they never acknowledged it. It was clearly an operation carried out by the Bulgarian Communist Party and the communist government, not only to silence Markov, but also, of course, to send out a warning to other people, to other Bulgarian dissidents, that they should sort of keep quiet. The problem with Markov is that he had been an insider in the Communist Party, and then he left. And those people are very different from somebody like Havel or somebody like Lech Walesa, who had never been inside the communist structure, inside the communist house of cards. They'd always been outside. But Markov had once upon a time been a communist, and so he knew a lot about the dirty laundry of people like Zhivkov. He knew about the inside affairs, and he could speak very articulately and very eloquently about that. Now, it's one of the few things that people know about Bulgaria. It was one of the few times Bulgaria came onto the radar in the Cold War. Excuse me. And Markov is forever known as the man, the unfortunate soul who was killed on London Bridge by a poison tip umbrella. And there is some black humor you can imagine about this. But it's a bit of a shame because Markov's essays and Markov's broadcasts, which were published in English under the title The Truth That Killed, of course he died by the time they were published, are actually very good. He writes with great insight about the Bulgarian tourist industry, about Zhivkov, about the nature of Bulgarian communism. He writes very critically, of course, but he does write very well about the hypocrisy, about the fact that certain party members get paid much more than the average Bulgarian who lives in poverty. He has a great sort of sardonic wit, and perhaps this is one of the reasons why the Bulgarian communists were so nervous about him and what he could potentially do in terms of exposing them, and why ultimately they decided to kill him. Although it does, like I say, it does seem not a victim blame, but it does seem that he was warned, and quite courageously he refused. That he should be quiet, and quite courageously he carried on doing it. He carried on sending out these messages. Okay, the other thing that's very interesting, and again, a very sad story, is the so-called revival process. Now, I mentioned earlier that Bulgaria, because it was part of the Ottoman Empire, there had been a history of conversion. And there was a portion of the Bulgarian population, between 10 and 15%, depending on the census that you're talking about, which was of the Muslim faith, or was Turkish. So ethnic Turks were the largest part of the population, but there were also some Slavic Muslims. So those were Turks that had arrived during the Ottoman period as colonists. But there were also Slavic Muslims in the Bulgarian context. They're called Pomaks. And those, of course, were formerly Christians, just like in Bosnia, formerly Christians that converted to Islam. Their ancestors converted to Islam during the period of the Ottoman Empire. Now, successive regimes had to deal. The independent Bulgaria had sort of felt like this was an issue that they had to deal with. When the country gained independence, first of all, in 1878, much of that population were killed, essentially victims of genocidal policies. They were ethnically cleansed, forcibly deported. This happened again during the Balkan Wars in 1912, 1913, the First World War from 1915 onwards. Bulgaria entered the First World War in 1915. But successive regimes were sort of thinking, what do we do with this population? This this a-national element. Do we work with them? Do we treat them as a minority? Do we try to assimilate them? Do we simply kill them or deport them? So Bulgarian regimes, be royal or communist, looked at this population and tried to decide what to sort of do with it. Now, the communist regime that came to power in 1945 hoped that they would be able to, in a sense, assimilate this population, or rather, that the arrival of communism would mean that the differences between Bulgarians and Turks on the territory of Bulgaria would begin to diminish. that they would be, that there would be, that those distinctions would be less important, that everybody would be citizens under communism, that this political program, this ideology would evolve people to move away, and then they would say, look, these are problems of the past, problems of feudalism, problems of the empire. Those are not problems that those are problems that the Communist Party and communist rule will solve. Now, it didn't work out that way, and the Communist Party under Zhivkov moved through different phases, and the most intense phase was the so-called revival process of the 1980s. It began in 1984, it kind of ended in 1989, and this was a brief but very intense period where Zhivkov decided that he would now, having failed in other ways to sort of convince this population to sort of abandon their differentiation, that they would become essentially Bulgarian, they would now forcibly become Bulgarian citizens. So, they had to change their names, they had to renounce religion, mosques and madrasas and schools were closed down. They were forced to sort of speak Bulgarian. This was a very intense, attempt to sort of assimilate this population into the Bulgarian nation. It's about 10% at this time, about 10% of the population. Now, this also failed, and ultimately, in the sort of the summer of 1989, unbeknownst at the time, Zhivkov didn't have much longer to rule the country, nor did the communists. But about that time, Zhivkov decided, okay, since this isn't working, the best thing to do is just to simply remove this population. So he opened up the borders. This was known as the Great Excursion. And essentially, the ethnic Turks were invited to leave the country and to go to Turkey. I've included a contemporary newsreel from BBC in Turkey, which shows images of these Turkish families being sort of packed onto trains and sent back to Turkey, which, to its credit, did welcome them and did let them in. These are people who had lived for, in some cases, hundreds of years. Their families had lived in Bulgaria. Many of them didn't know Turkish. They'd never been to Turkey. Travel was quite difficult at that time because of the Iron Curtain. So it's a remarkable and quite ruthless acknowledgement on the part of Zhivkov and the Bulgarian communists that their policies of assimilation had failed. Now, it's interesting in and of itself, but there's a couple of points that I want to sort of make about this. The first is that if we compare to Yugoslavia, which we'll talk about the week after next, in a couple of weeks' time, but which we have talked about before. Do you remember that I talked about how Bulgaria had a federal republic, and it was one country ruled by the Communist Party, but there were 6 socialist republics: Slovenia, Serbia, Bosnia, Montenegro, Macedonia, and Croatia. Because of this kind of federal structure, to a certain extent, the approach to the Muslim population in Yugoslavia taken by Tito was quite different from the one taken by Zhivkov. No attempt at assimilation, no attempt at forcibly converting or changing the Muslim population, but a kind of a gradual acknowledgement that this is a different group, that within the context of federal Yugoslavia, with its different republics and with its different nations, the Bosnian Muslim population can have some sort of separate identity. So this began with the borders of the Bosnian Republic. By the 1960s, that this sort of began with the acknowledgement that this was a separate nation, or rather nationality, and then ultimately that this was a fully blown nation. And it's very complicated the way things worked in Yugoslavia. I'll explain it in more detail in a couple of weeks' time, but there are various levels of citizenship. A nation was the highest level, and beneath that there was one which we call in English nationality, but it makes more sense when you say it in Serbian. But anyway, I'll talk about that in a couple of weeks' time. there was not that attempt in Bulgaria. No federalization, very little acknowledgement of minority rights, partially because Bulgaria did not have the complexity in terms of different nations and different groups. They basically had the Bulgarians, who were 90% of the population, and then you had small minorities, of which the largest was the Turkish minority. So there was no attempt at federalization, none of these kind of minority issues. And this assimilation, in a sense, is the sort of the last attempt to to sort of forcibly turn these former turn these Turkish citizens into Bulgarians. The other thing is, and I'm not entirely convinced about this argument, but there have been people who've made it, and it is a kind of interesting one. When you watch the footage, which lasts about 15 minutes, the BBC reporter is essentially saying that nothing like this, that a refugee column of this scale has not been seen since the Second World War, since 1945. And that's not entirely accurate, but there's a sense that those scenes have not been seen. Sadly, they would very soon be seen again in the Balkans, in Yugoslavia, with the conflict and with the war and with the ethnic cleansing and with the genocide that was taking place in places like Bosnia and in Kosovo. But at the time, it hadn't been seen, and there are people who argue that the fact that Zhivkov carried out this act of ethnic cleansing against the Turkish population without meaningful censure by the international community, although the UN complained, although the Turkish government complained, no repercussions fell upon Zhivkov. Perhaps they would have done if he stayed in power longer. Perhaps there would have been some sort of payback. But in the immediate context, there wasn't. There is an argument that this sort of showed Balkan leaders in Yugoslavia that you could get away with this kind of thing and not be confronted with a sort of with any trouble from the international community. I'm not entirely convinced, and part of the reason I'm not convinced is that I've never found any evidence of the people who committed genocide in ex-Yugoslavia. So those are people like Slobodan Milosevic, Radovan Karadzic, those sorts of people. They never really mentioned, I've never seen them mention Bulgaria at any level, not in public, not in their secret communiques, the intercepts, this kind of thing. And so it's strange if this was such an important moment for them that they never talked about it. But nevertheless, the idea is out there. And it is indeed, sorry to say, a very ominous sign of something that would be coming in a much more virulent, a much more violent trend later on. Okay, let's now finally move on to the star of the show, Lyudmila Zhivkova. As you can imagine, as you may have guessed, Lyudmila was the daughter of Todor Zhivkov, and in Bulgarian, if the female names usually take an A ending, and even if you have the same surname, it's like in Russian, Anna Karenina, but her husband is Karenin. And it's the same in Czech. Martina Navratilova, the tennis player, her father would have been, I don't know his name, but something Navratil. So they take the feminine form. So Zhivkova, Lyudmila, was born in 1942. She studied at the history at Sofia, also Moscow. Spent a year as a graduate student in Oxford. And came back to Sofia, came back to Bulgaria. In 1975, she became chair of the Committee for Art and Culture. And soon after that, I think in 1976, she was elected to the Politburo, which is like the main government, the main political bureau, Politburo of the of any communist party, of any communist regime. Any communist government, including the Bulgarian, the first woman to be elected as such. Now, Lyudmila was a fascinating figure for many reasons. You may well get a certain Ivanka Trump vibe from the fact that her daddy was the leader of the country, and now she becomes an important figure in the movement as well. But nevertheless, I'm not going to comment on Ivanka for the time being. By the way, Ivanka's mother is from Czechoslovakia. She's from Moravia. Ivana. She was a professional skier who competed for the Czechoslovak Olympic team. I can't remember the year. It's all true. But anyway, Lyudmila was nevertheless an interesting and intelligent and accomplished woman in her own right. She wrote scholarly studies of Bulgarian diplomacy with Russia, for example. And those are considered still, and for a long time have been considered important studies. People read them and people cited them. Now, at the international stage, she was keen to promote Bulgarian culture, Bulgarian history, and Bulgarian identity. And you must remember that now, then as now, Bulgaria was virtually unknown within outside of Bulgaria, within the West and internationally. It's a little bit better today, but even I'm someone who would study Balkan history and be someone who writes about Balkan history. But even in my field, Bulgaria is one of the lesser known countries. Most people would know about Greece because of its classical heritage. They would know about Yugoslavia because Yugoslavia is sort of fascinating with its many different nations and different peoples. But Bulgaria, and to a certain extent also Albania, are much less well known, and it was true then as well. So Lyudmila was extremely active and extremely energetic in promoting, calling upon her international networks, her international ties, and promoting a sense of Bulgarian distinctness, a sense of Bulgarian identity, of explaining Balkan history, of exhibiting Balkan history and Balkan identity across the world and establishing it in the minds and in the eyes of many people. One of the most famous things that she did, one of her most famous successes, was to tour large museums and exhibitors in Russia and in the West, and display sort of the archaeology of ancient Bulgaria. And from the 5th century right up until the Roman period, which is sort of the beginning of the, for Bulgaria, that's the beginning of the, it's like the 1st century AD. But before that, there was a Bulgarian civilization called the Thracian civilization. I've written it down there, the civilization of Thrace. And it created a lot of archaeological, incredible sort of archaeology and archaeological finds and archaeological treasures. You can see them in slide number 12. And Lyudmila would take these Thracian treasures and would tour with them. She would go to the Hermitage in St. Petersburg. She would go to the British Museum in London. She would go to exhibitors in the United States. And she would show that Bulgaria had this incredible prehistory, that it was more than just a satellite of Russia, it was more than just a satellite of the Soviet Union. It had its own identity, it had its own distinction. So it was one of the great achievements of Lyudmila that she established an independent identity for a country whose politics, run by her own father, was deeply, almost sycophantically subordinated to the Soviet Union, and in the eyes of many people, and including many Bulgarians, and much more in the eyes of the internationals, the international community, Bulgaria just was not an interesting place. It was just, its history was entangled with Russia. It didn't really have much life outside of that. It began and ended with Russia, and it just wasn't particularly a particularly remarkable country. Lyudmila established and succeeded in the 70s in establishing Bulgaria as an independently spirited Bulgarian nation, a Bulgarian state. Now, the other thing that Lyudmila was interested in was the East and esoteric matters. She was fascinated by yoga. Now, yoga in today's Balkans is making footholds, but you know, it is not huge like it is in the West. There aren't that many yoga studios, but they are an expanding business. But Lyudmila was fascinated by these sorts of things. And in the 1970s in Bulgaria, to introduce these Eastern ideas was really quite radical. She was also vegetarian. And anyone who's traveled in the Balkans will know that it's it's very often difficult, if not impossible, to find a vegetarian option on menus. You know, it's basically grilled meat and maybe a shopska salad alongside it. But basically, it's very often it's quite difficult. It was much more difficult in the 1970s. So Lyudmila would visit yogis in India, Maharaja in India. She would go out to these places. She would commune with Eastern forms of Eastern spiritualism, and she would bring them back to Bulgaria. Now, these were relatively embarrassing for the Communist Party because Lyudmila was on the Politburo. And the communists were, like political scientists. They believed in the science of history. They believed that Marxism was a social science, and that these Eastern traditions did not, they were vacuous. They were not, they weren't meaningful things. They were just kind of unenlightened, atavistic, obscurantist philosophies, and Zhivkova took them very seriously. These were not affectations. These were not, the sort of the how can I put it, the whims of like a Hollywood celebrity or something getting interested briefly in Eastern philosophy and then moving on. Zhivkova took these things very seriously, and in a sense brought them back to Bulgaria. One of her most famous relationships was with the woman, this remarkable figure featured in slide number 13. This is Baba Vanga, grandmother Vanga. She was a very elderly, blind mystic and soothsayer who lived in Petric, which is in the Macedonian part of near the Macedonian border, what was then the Yugoslav border with Bulgaria. And she was a woman who lived in rural Petric, and people would come to her, and she would tell their fortunes, and she believed that she had she was like a clairvoyant. She could read people's minds, and she could tell the future. The Communist Party, of course, had no business with her, just like any other kind of religion or spirituality. This was not part of communist science. But Lyudmila, with her interests in alternative forms of spiritualism and alternative forms of philosophy and Eastern philosophy and Orientalist philosophy, visited Baba Vanga and listened to her and took what she said seriously. So this was also quite an embarrassing thing for her father and for the communist regime, that you would have this high-ranking member of the Politburo meeting with people like Baba Vanga and sort of espousing what they believed to be voodoo ideas. And maybe, look, I'm not, who knows, maybe, I'm sure many of you will also be quite skeptical of the notion that a blind elderly person in rural Bulgaria has some sort of mystical ability to read minds and tell the future. But keep an open mind. I never met her, unfortunately. She died in 1996. But it's quite a fascinating life and a fascinating story. Nevertheless, she was born blind. By the way, she was born without eyes. So her eyes were removed at a very young age. She was blind throughout her entire life. So, the other thing I guess I would have to say, the other thing I need to sort of mention about Lyudmila is that she was remarkably popular. She's relatively young. She died in 1981. I'm going to come to that in a minute. But she was a young woman, and she was very popular in Bulgaria. She was really very well loved. I guess part of the reason for this is, and this story kind of intrigues me as well. And what intrigues me about Lyudmila is that whatever we decide that we think about her visits to Baba Vanga and her Orientalist interest in esoteric philosophy, compared to her father, and compared to the regime that her father was managing and was running, which was unbelievably bureaucratic and boring and uninteresting and subordinate to Moscow. Lyudmila was really a breath of color, very vivid in her intelligence, in her interest in ancient Bulgarian history and Bulgarian diplomatic history, and interested in asking questions about what is Bulgaria, why is it a distinct nation, what is it, what does it mean to be Bulgarian, what is our history and our culture, and what do all of these things mean, and also there's kind of visits to yogis in India and these sorts of visits, these sorts of things. She was really quite a personality, and something very different from what you're seeing in Bulgaria. Now, remember what I said in the last lecture. This is the period of late socialism. It's a period where, for many people, belief in the political system is over. They tolerate it, they work with it, but they're not blind, no pun intended, to Baba Vanga, to its dysfunctionality. They're not blind to the hypocrisy of its slogans. Many people in Bulgaria felt that way, and in a sense, what Lyudmila was creating was a space for sort of belief, a space for inspiration, a space for a space for sort of color in what was admittedly a very grey, otherwise a very grey existence. And this is perhaps the reason why it's a question of contrast with with her father and with her father's government and her father's regime that created the sort of the appeal. Now, she died quite young in 1939. She was 39 when she died in 1981. So she has that kind of Princess Diana vibe. And there's no reason to think, and I would be somebody who would look hard at these conspiracy theories, but there's no reason to believe that it was not simply she died of an illness. But there were very many rumors that that the KGB had killed her. And the reason they did this is because she was promoting a Bulgarian identity, which was separate and distinct from from Russia, and that this was unacceptable to many people within the Soviet Union. It's kind of the one of the tragedies of this early death was that the great pièce de résistance of Lyudmila's cultural activities would have been, had she lived to see it, in 1981, the 1300th anniversary of the foundation of the Bulgarian state. Now, my friend Teodora is writing a book about this, hasn't been published yet, so I can't recommend it. But I have no doubt that it's going to be a fascinating one. Under the coordination of Lyudmila Zhivkova, the 1300th anniversary was to be a huge pageant of all of these things that she was interested in, a great articulation in statues and in movies and in documentaries and in public spaces of the distinct nature of Bulgarian identity. Now, one of the most remarkable things is this that I put down in slide number 14. I also put it in the booklet, but I'm showing it to you now. This is in a small town called Shumen which is in the middle of Bulgaria, close to the Balkan mountain range. So there's a huge mountain range running through the middle of the country, and it's called the Old Mountain Range, the Balkan Mountain Range, and it's actually this mountain range that gives the entire region, the Balkan region, its name. This is an incredible cubist monument in slide number 14, which is celebrating the ancient Khans, so the founding fathers of the Bulgarian Empire, way back in the medieval period, and it's you get a sort of a sense of the weirdness and the sort of the enormous scale of this monument from these images which I've put up. But I mean, if you ever get the chance, I may have mentioned this a few times that I lived in Bulgaria last year whilst I was on a research fellowship, and I visited Shumen. And Shumen is really in the middle of nowhere. It's quite difficult to get to. It's a small town, and it's a very sad fact that in Bulgaria, the country it's the fastest shrinking country in the world. Its population is declining precipitously, partially because it has a low birth rate, but also partially because people are leaving. Many of them are moving to Sofia, the capital, which is actually quite lively, but many more are just simply leaving the country because it's quite poor, and the job opportunities are not great. So they're going to Germany, they're going to the Netherlands, they're going to Canada and the United States. So you arrive in Shumen, and it has this diminished feel because it's a city which was partially built by the communists and has a great railway station, and it has a great cultural center, and all of these things are sort of deserted. And then you have to, you can go up to the mountains. My friend and I traveled, and we got in this taxi, she and I, and we went up, we went up to this monument. And so I can understand Bulgarian, and my friend at the time, who I was traveling with at the time, is a Russian, and so she could also more or less understand because the languages are quite similar. And this taxi driver was pretty funny. He was driving us up to this monument, and he was saying, "Why are you going to see this? Just communist trash. You don't want to see this thing. Why don't you go see something else? Why don't you go see one of the national monuments? Or what the hell are you interested in this thing?" But anyway, he took us to this monument, and he waited, and then and we walked around this monument for about an hour. And it's really, you have to see it if you ever get the chance. It's something to sort of see it in to be there. It's really very foreboding. It perched on the edge of a mountain, looking down onto Shumen, the city, now essentially a semi-deserted town. And it's really, and I've seen big monuments like from celebrating victories in the Napoleonic War in Germany, and the monument to Mother Russia, to the homeland in Kiev, in Ukraine, which is also huge. But this is really up there with them. This is something, and also this strange cubist style is quite remarkable. My point here is that all of this is an attempt to sort of try to do something different, to show that Bulgaria is more than just an outpost of the Soviet Union, that it is a state with its own identity, with its own state traditions. The monument to the foundation of the Bulgarian state in Shumen is an example of an attempt to sort of do something different. I think it's a successful attempt. The taxi driver that we were traveling with didn't think so, but each to their own. Okay, finally, the great and still standing, the great sort of achievement of Lyudmila Zhivkova is the Palace of Culture in Sofia, which I put in slide number 15. It's still there to this day, slightly changed. There's a monument that used to be out in front, which has been taken down. But this is a huge complex with a theatre and a cinema and restaurants and cafes, and a massive kind of hall where party congresses were held from 1981 onwards. In the second picture on the right-hand side, you can see the mountain at the edge of Vitosha. At the edge of Sofia, it's called the Vitosha Mountain. In the background, this is one of the great achievements of Lyudmila Zhivkova as well. Okay, well, what was the point of all that to wrap up? And I wasn't as brief as I hoped I would be. So I once again, I apologize. Well, I had two aims really. The first is to introduce you to Bulgaria, which is a country that we didn't speak about much so far on this module, but is nevertheless, I hope, some of you will have been persuaded is a very interesting one and a very fascinating one, and tells a lot about the nature of communism under Central and Eastern Europe after the Second World War. And the second is to show how, again, this was a lecture ostensibly about an individual. And the case, I think, the career and the biography of Lyudmila Zhivkova shows how some spark of color and interest can be realized and can be achieved in an otherwise very routinized, bureaucratized state such as Zhivkov's Bulgaria in the 1980s, and it is also an attempt, not entirely unsuccessful, to sort of achieve an independent, distinct kind of national identity for a state like Bulgaria. Okay, thank you very much.